Your heart contracted approximately 4,200 times while you were reading the script's first paragraph. You felt none of them. No soreness the next morning. No pump. No visible hypertrophy in any mirror. And because you could not feel it, could not see it, could not track it with any metric the fitness industry has taught you to watch, you did not train it. This is the most consequential training gap in human health. And almost nobody frames it correctly. The heart is a muscle, not metaphorically, not in the loose sense that people mean when they say something requires heart. The myocardium, the muscular wall of the heart, is composed of cardiac myocytes, cells that contract and relax in response to electrical signals that consume ATP to power that contraction, that require oxygen continuously to regenerate that ATP, and that adapt structurally and biochemically in response to the demands placed on them. The biology is the same as skeletal muscle. The physics of contraction, the mitochondrial machinery generating energy, the capillary networks supplying oxygen, all of it follows the same principles as the quadriceps or the biceps. The difference is access. You cannot consciously contract your heart. You cannot isolate it. You cannot put under a barbell and progressively overload it the way you overload a hamstring. The motor control that drives cardiac contraction runs entirely through the autonomic nervous system and the heart's own conduction system. The sinoatrial node setting pace, the electrical signal propagating through the atrioventricular node, the bundle of the Purkinje fibers until the entire ventricle contracts as a unit. Your cortex is not involved. Your intention is irrelevant. What you can do is manipulate the demand placed on the heart by making the rest of the body require more from it. And in that indirect control lies the entire science of cardiovascular training. The heart responds to demand. When the skeletal muscles of the legs and arms and trunk require more oxygen during exercise, they signal the cardiovascular system through metabolic mediators, falling oxygen tension, rising carbon dioxide, accumulating lactate, local vasodilators, and cardiac output rises to meet the demand. Heart rate increases. Stroke volume increases. The product of these two, cardiac output, rises from its resting value of approximately 5 liters per minute to 20, 25, sometimes 35 or more liters per minute in elite athletes during maximal exercise. That demand, repeated consistently over weeks and months, is the training stimulus the heart muscle responds to, and the adaptations it drives in cardiac myocytes, in the capillary networks supplying them, in the geometry of the left ventricle, are the biological changes that determine how long you live. Nobody tells you this. The fitness industry sells you the mirror. The mirror shows skeletal muscle. The muscle that is quietly deciding your longevity sits inside your chest, beating 100,000 times per day, receiving whatever stimulus your choices provide. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A cardiac myocyte is a specialized cell that is committed entirely to one function: contraction. It cannot dedifferentiate. It cannot meaningfully divide in adults. When a cardiac myocyte dies, in a heart attack, in chronic ischemia, in the slow attrition of age, it is generally replaced by collagen rather than by a new functioning cell. The heart is not a regenerating tissue in any meaningful clinical sense. This irreplaceability makes the health of each individual cardiac myocyte more consequential than the health of individual skeletal muscle cells, which can be replaced from satellite cell pools. What you do to your cardiac myocytes across a lifetime, you do permanently. Inside each cardiac myocyte, mitochondria occupy approximately 30 to 35% of cell volume, a far higher proportion than in skeletal muscle, where mitochondrial content varies with fiber type and training status. The high mitochondrial density is not excess. The heart runs almost entirely on oxidative phosphorylation. Unlike skeletal muscle, which can sustain short bursts of anaerobic metabolism, the heart cannot accumulate a meaningful oxygen debt. It operates in continuous aerobic mode, beat after beat after beat, and the mitochondrial machinery that supplies ATP for each contraction must be continuously fed with oxygen and substrate. Cardiac mitochondria differ from skeletal muscle mitochondria in a specific way that matters here. They preferentially oxidize fatty acids rather than glucose. Approximately 60 to 70% of the heart's ADP comes from fatty acid oxidation at rest, with the remainder from glucose, lactate, and ketones. During exercise, the substrate mix shifts somewhat, but the oxidative nature of the process does not. The heart does not go glycolytic when pushed. It demands more oxygen and more substrate, and when the supply falls short, contractile function degrades rapidly. This substrate dependency makes the capillary supply to the myocardium as critical as the mitochondrial machinery itself. In a healthy heart, the ratio of capillaries to cardiac muscle fibers is approximately 1:1. 1 capillary per fiber, sometimes more. The capillary density of the myocardium is among the highest of any tissue in the body because the metabolic demand per unit volume is among the highest of any tissue in the body. When cardiac output rises during exercise, the coronary arteries dilate, increasing blood flow to myocardium to match the increased contraction frequency and force. At maximal exercise, coronary blood flow can increase 4 to 5 times its resting value. The system works because the capillary network is dense enough to deliver that flow to every fiber, and because the coronary artery wall retains enough compliance to dilate in response to the metabolic demand. Sedentary behavior degrades both. Coronary artery compliance follows the same vascular smooth muscle pathway described in the reference video. Without adequate shear stress from elevated blood flow, the endothelium reduces nitric oxide production, the smooth muscle shifts toward the synthetic phenotype, and the vessel stiffens. A stiffer coronary artery dilates less under the metabolic stimulus of exercise. The capillary supply to the myocardium also responds to chronic demand levels. In trained hearts, capillary density per unit of cardiac muscle volume is higher than in untrained hearts. The network grows or regresses based on whether the oxygen demand consistently exceeds the current supply. A sedentary heart, receiving no training stimulus across years, is a heart whose coronary compliance is declining, whose capillary density is not being maintained, and whose mitochondrial machinery is receiving no signal to expand its capacity. The muscle is alive. It is contracting reliably, and it is quietly losing its reserve capacity, one unstimulated year at a time. Every time your heart contracts, it ejects a volume of blood into the aorta. That volume is the stroke volume. At rest, in an average adult, stroke volume is approximately 60 to 80 milliliters per beat, multiplied by resting heart rate, roughly 70 beats per minute. And you get cardiac output of approximately 5 liters per minute, which is the entire blood volume of a typical adult circulating through the system once every minute. Stroke volume is a metric where the biggest biological differences between trained and untrained hearts appear, and it is a metric that most directly connects to longevity. In a trained endurance athlete, resting stroke volume can be 100 to 130 milliliters per beat. The heart ejects more blood per contraction than an untrained heart. Because the cardiac output demand at rest is fixed by metabolic needs, approximately 5 liters per minute regardless of fitness level, a higher stroke volume means a lower resting heart rate. The trained heart beats 40 to 50 times per minute instead of 70 because each beat does more work. This is not incidental. Resting heart rate is one of the most consistently replicated predictors of cardiovascular mortality in epidemiology. In the Framingham Heart Study and in multiple subsequent large cohort studies, resting heart rate below 60 beats per minute is associated with lower all-cause mortality, while resting heart rate above 80 is associated with measurably higher risk, independent of other cardiovascular risk factors. Each 10 beat per minute increase in resting heart rate above 60 carries a mortality risk increase of approximately 10 to 18% across different study populations. The mechanism is not that a slow heart rate is directly protective. The mechanism is that a high resting heart rate in the absence of disease reflects inadequate stroke volume, which reflects inadequate left ventricular chamber size and wall compliance, which reflect inadequate training stimulus across the prior months and years. A sedentary heart beats faster to compensate for each beat doing less work. The structural basis of stroke volume is the left ventricle. Endurance training produces what cardiologists call eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. The left ventricular cavity enlarges, its wall stays proportionally thin, and the muscle becomes more compliant. A larger chamber fills with more blood during diastole, and the more compliant wall stretches to accommodate that filling. The Frank-Starling mechanism then amplifies contraction. A more stretched ventricle contracts with greater force, ejecting a higher fraction of the fill volume. Stroke volume rises from both the larger filling volume and the more forceful ejection. This eccentric remodeling is the hallmark of the trained heart, described precisely by Polliccia and colleagues in data from Olympic athletes published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and subsequently confirmed in numerous training intervention studies, showing measurable left ventricular enlargement after 8 to 12 weeks of consistent aerobic training in previously sedentary adults. Contrast this with the pathological hypertrophy produced by chronic hypertension. In hypertension, the left ventricle wall thickens concentrically. The cavity does not enlarge. The wall adds mass to push against elevated resistance, and the wall becomes stiffer rather than more compliant. Filling is impaired. Stroke volume may actually fall. This is a cardiac remodeling that precedes heart failure, and it is biomechanically the opposite of the adaptive remodeling that endurance training produces. The heart physically changes shape in response to the demands placed on it. Train the muscle, and it remodels toward a larger, more compliant, more efficient pump. Ignore it, and leave the downstream consequences to chance. VO2 max is the maximum rate at which your body can consume oxygen during maximal exercise. Its units are milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. A sedentary adult in their 50s might have a VO2 max of 28 to 32. A recreational runner might be at 40 to 45. Elite endurance athletes reach 70 to 85 and occasionally higher. The number reflects the capacity of the entire oxygen transport chain, the lungs moving air, the blood carrying oxygen, the heart pumping that blood, and the muscles extracting and using the oxygen delivered. Of these four components, the heart is the primary limiting factor in most people. The lungs have more than adequate capacity. The blood's oxygen-carrying capacity, while trainable through red blood cell adaptations, is not typically the bottleneck. The peripheral muscles can extract oxygen efficiently across a wide range of delivery rates. What determines VO2 max, in most people most of the time, is maximal cardiac output, how much blood the heart can pump a minute at its limit. Maximal cardiac output equals maximal heart rate multiplied by maximal stroke volume. Maximal heart rate is largely fixed by age and genetics, declining predictably at approximately 1 beat per minute per year of age after 20. It is not meaningfully trainable. Maximal stroke volume, by contrast, is highly trainable. It is the left ventricular volume, wall compliance, and myocardial contractility that endurance training increases. VO2 max is therefore primarily a measure of the heart's pumping capacity, wrapped in a metric that also captures the body's oxygen transport and utilization efficiency. Its relationship to mortality is the most consistent finding in exercise physiology. In 2018, Sager and colleagues published data in JAMA Network Open following 122,282 patients who underwent exercise treadmill testing at the Cleveland Clinic over 23 years. The mortality prediction from cardiorespiratory fitness was steeper than from any other risk factor in the dataset, steeper than smoking, hypertension, diabetes, or end-stage kidney disease. Patients in the lowest fitness quintile had a mortality risk 5 times higher than those in the highest quintile, moving from the lowest to merely the second lowest fitness category, a modest improvement achievable in weeks. Cut the mortality hazard ratio by more than any other single intervention in the dataset. Peter Attia, who has written about longevity medicine extensively, has described VO2 max as the single most powerful predictor of long-term mortality that exists in medicine, and the Sager data supports that framing. The number is not tracking fitness as a proxy for health. It is tracking the functional capacity of the heart muscle directly, and the heart's capacity is the upstream determinant of how well every other organ in the body is perfused, supplied, and maintained. A heart with high VO2 max is a heart with high stroke volume, low resting heart rate, high coronary compliance, dense capillary supply, and high mitochondrial capacity. Every one of those properties is protective. Every one of them responds to training, and every one of them degrades in its absence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The heart does not rust. This is a misleading comfort of cardiac aging. The organ keeps beating reliably long after its reserve capacity has collapsed, and the collapse is invisible until a demand arrives that exceeds the reserve. VO2 max declines at approximately 1% per year after age 25 in sedentary individuals. By age 55, a sedentary person who had a VO2 max of 45 at May 25th have a VO2 max of 30. By 65, it may be at 20 to 22. These are the numbers that, in the Man-Sager data, place a person in the lowest fitness quintile with a five-fold elevated mortality risk. The decline has three biological sources. First, maximum heart rate falls. This is largely non-negotiable. The age-related decline in sinoatrial node pacemaker activity reduces peak heart rate at approximately 1 beat per minute per year. This component of VO2 max decline is not significantly trainable. Second, stroke volume falls in sedentary individuals as the left ventricle loses its eccentric remodeling over decades of inadequate stimulus. The cavity does not enlarge further. The walls do not maintain compliance that training would provide. The Frank-Starling filling advantage is not developed. Third, the peripheral muscle mitochondrial capacity falls. This is a skeletal muscle change, not a cardiac one, but affects the oxygen extraction at the working muscles and therefore contributes to declining VO2 max. The cardiac component and the skeletal muscle component both respond to training, even as the heart rate component does not. This is the biology that makes the mortality curve in the Man-Sager data modifiable. The decline is real. Its rate is a choice. The changes that sedentary decades impose on the heart muscle beyond VO2 max are subtler but cumulative. Cardiac collagen content increases with age and with low activity levels. The connective tissue between myocytes thickens, reducing the compliance of the left ventricular wall and impairing diastolic filling. The heart stiffens in a pattern analogous to the arterial stiffness described in the reference material. The muscle becomes less yielding, less efficient at filling during the relaxation phase between beats. Diastolic dysfunction, impaired left ventricular filling, is now recognized as a major cause of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, a condition in which the heart contracts normally but cannot fill adequately. It is among the fastest growing cardiac diagnoses in adults over 65, and its prevalence correlates directly with decades of physical inactivity. The exercise capacity of the heart does not fail all at once. It diminishes across each sedentary year until a clinical event marks the endpoint of a process that began decades earlier and was always modifiable. The heart responds to one training stimulus, sustained elevation of cardiac output above resting levels. This is not complicated, but it is specific, and the specifics distinguish training from activity. Walking to the car is an activity. It briefly elevates cardiac output and then returns it to baseline. The cardiac myocytes received a stimulus too brief and too modest to drive the adaptations that matter. Left ventricular remodeling, increased stroke volume, improved coronary compliance, expanded capillary density. Activity is not the same as training. Training requires the cardiac output to remain elevated for a sustained period, repeatedly, at an intensity that genuinely stresses the current capacity of the heart. The mechanism is the same as for skeletal muscle. Adaptation requires a stimulus that exceeds the current comfortable operating range, applied consistently enough to signal that the excess demand is not temporary. For the heart, the practical translation is sustained aerobic exercise at moderate to vigorous intensity for periods long enough to maintain elevated cardiac output. The Fick principle governs this. VO2 equals cardiac output multiplied by the arterial-venous oxygen difference. To improve VO2 max, you must either increase cardiac output or increase oxygen extraction at the muscles, or both. The primary lever for most people is cardiac output, getting the heart to pump more blood per minute for sustained periods. Hirofumi Tanaka at the University of Texas, whose research on cardiovascular aging and exercise has been published across decades of peer-reviewed literature, established through multiple training intervention studies that the minimum effective dose for meaningful left ventricular remodeling in previously sedentary adults is approximately 150 minutes per week of moderate-intensity aerobic activity, distributed across at least 3 sessions. This aligns with the public health guidelines that emerged from epidemiological data, but Tanaka's physiological work showed a mechanism. At this dose, left ventricular end diastolic volume measurably increases, stroke volume rises, and resting heart rate falls over 8 to 12 weeks in adults across a wide age range. The intensity threshold matters. Moderate intensity corresponds to approximately 50 to 70% of VO2 max, or roughly 60 to 75% of maximum heart rate. At this intensity, cardiac output is elevated to 2 to 3 times its resting value, maintained continuously for the duration of the session. Below this threshold, the stimulus is insufficient for left ventricular remodeling. Above it, into vigorous intensity, additional benefits accrue. The research on high-intensity interval training shows faster VO2 max improvements and additional cardiac adaptation. But a moderate threshold is where the most consequential shift from sedentary to active occurs, and it is accessible to people who have not exercised in years. The type of exercise matters less than its intensity and duration. Walking, cycling, swimming, rowing, elliptical, any activity that uses large muscle groups rhythmically and sustains cardiac output in the target range provides a stimulus. The heart muscle does not distinguish between walking and swimming. It responds to oxygen demand. Whatever activity creates sustained oxygen demand at the appropriate intensity trains the heart. One additional stimulus deserves specific mention: Zone 2 training, which has received significant attention in longevity medicine circles through the work of Inigo San Millán at the University of Colorado. Zone 2 corresponds to the highest intensity at which lactate production and clearance are balanced, roughly 60 to 70% of VO2 max for most people, a conversational but clearly aerobic pace. At this intensity, the mitochondrial machinery of both the cardiac myocytes and the working skeletal muscle is maximally stressed within the oxidative range. San Millán's data from professional cyclists and subsequent work in non-athlete populations showed that Zone 2 training specifically expands mitochondrial density and improves fat oxidation capacity in a way that higher intensity training does not replicate fully. For the cardiac myocytes specifically, this means that sustained Zone 2 work, 45 to 60 minutes at a conversational aerobic pace, 3 to 4 times per week, provides the optimal stimulus for the mitochondrial adaptations that underlie the long-term protective changes in cardiac muscle function. 12 weeks of consistent aerobic training at moderate intensity produces measurable changes in the heart that appear in imaging studies, in functional testing, and in resting physiological parameters. Left ventricular end diastolic volume, the amount of blood the ventricle fills with during its relaxation phase, increases by 10 to 20% in previously sedentary adults after 8 to 12 weeks of training. This is eccentric remodeling. The chamber is physically larger. It accommodates more blood with each fill. The wall stretches more. The Frank-Starling mechanism amplifies the subsequent contraction. Stroke volume rises as a direct consequence. Resting heart rate falls. A heart with higher stroke volume needs fewer beats per minute to maintain the same cardiac output at rest. After 12 weeks of consistent training, resting heart rate reductions of 5 to 8 beats per minute are typical in previously sedentary adults. Over years of sustained training, resting heart rates of 50 to 60 beats per minute are achievable in people who started in their 50s or 60s. Those numbers translate directly into mortality curves. Each 10 beat per minute reduction in resting heart rate carries meaningful risk reduction in longitudinal data. VO2 max increases. In previously sedentary adults, 12-week moderate intensity training programs typically produce VO2 max improvements of 10 to 20%. A person at a VO2 max of 24, in the lowest fitness quintile in the Mann-Sager data, with a 5-fold elevated mortality risk, who improves to 28 after 12 weeks has moved into the second lowest quintile. The mortality hazard ratio drops by more than half at that transition, based on the Cleveland Clinic data. 12 weeks of training moves a person across the most consequential boundary in the mortality curve. The coronary arteries respond in parallel. Nitric oxide production by the coronary endothelium increases within days of beginning regular aerobic training, as shear stress rises with each training session and the enos factory upregulates. Coronary compliance improves over weeks. The vessels that supply the myocardium become more responsive to the metabolic signals the heart sends during exertion, dilating more completely, delivering more blood per unit of demand. These changes compound across years. The heart at 12 weeks of training is measurably different from the heart at week 0. The heart at 5 years of consistent training is categorically different. The left ventricular remodeling has continued. The resting heart rate has continued to fall. The VO2 max has continued to rise, or at minimum has declined at a substantially slower rate than the sedentary decline curve would predict. Robert Salas, working in the Kaiser Permanente exercise prescription program, has described exercise as the closest thing to a polypill that medicine has, a single intervention that simultaneously addresses the mechanisms of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, cognitive decline, and cancer through overlapping pathways that no pharmacological combination fully replicates. His clinical data, published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, show that patients who met physical activity guidelines had dramatically lower rates of cardiovascular events, hospitalizations, and all-cause mortality than those who did not, across every age group in the dataset. The compound interest of cardiac training works in both directions. The heart that trains accumulates protective adaptations that reinforce each other. Higher stroke volume reduces the heart rate demand. Lower resting heart rate reduces myocardial oxygen consumption. Better coronary compliance supplies more oxygen per unit of demand. Each adaptation makes the next one more accessible. The trained heart becomes progressively easier to maintain in its trained state. The heart that does not train loses the same adaptations in the same reinforcing pattern, but in reverse. Declining stroke volume increases resting heart rate. Elevated resting heart rate increases myocardial oxygen consumption. Declining coronary compliance reduces oxygen delivery to a heart that is already working harder per beat than it should. Each loss makes the next one more likely. The VO2 max you have in your 60s is substantially determined by what you did in your 40s and 50s. The VO2 max you will have in your 70s is being determined now. This is not a counsel of despair for anyone who has been sedentary. The Mansager data shows clearly that even moving from the lowest fitness quintile to the second lowest, a modest improvement achievable in weeks, cuts mortality risk by more than any pharmaceutical intervention in the dataset. The muscle nobody tells you to strengthen is beating in your chest right now, approximately 100,000 times today. It is made of cells that respond to demand, that remodel in response to stimulus, that build capillary networks and expand mitochondrial machinery when consistently asked to perform above their current comfortable range. It does not appear in any gym program. It does not respond to any supplement. It does not show up in any mirror. And it is, by the measure the best longitudinal data medicine has, the single most important muscle in your body. It is waiting for the stimulus it was designed to receive. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.